Thank you for being with me for these many lessons. Today we'll summarize. We're going to talk about creativity revisited, and we'll do it through the lens of history. I want you to take a look at a student project. This student project was videotaped in response to a project. There was a video that was called The Emperor's Flying. And in this video, it talked about how a person flew using a kite-like device in China, and how the emperor became frightened and killed the person because the emperor didn't want that new technology to be seen. We asked students to make videos that presented the same concept, but in a modern environment. Take a look at this video and see what you think. I hope you'll enjoy it.
I was the president of the Peach Street Club and captain of our perennial championship baseball team. I was solely responsible to carry on the 20-year legacy of the Peach Street Club and uphold our most important rule. Membership can only be granted to those who figured out and were able to get in the clubhouse. Wyatt, my best friend, has tried for years to get into the club, but has never been able to find his way in. Once I suggested breaking the rules for him. I almost got kicked out myself. It's really not that hard to get into the club. Gina has been a member for 3 years. She's 9. My little brother Zach just joined this year. He aspires to be the president. In all, there are 12 active members and 124 alumni, all of whom figured out how to get into the clubhouse themselves.
Are all the club members going to be at our game on Saturday? Because I want to smash those Bears.
Oh crap, Henry hurt his leg, so we don't have a catcher. Oh, this sucks.
What about White? He's an amazing catcher.
Yeah.
We'd definitely win with him.
Yeah.
You know the rules. Only club members allowed.
But
One afternoon later that week, we decided to meet in the club to figure out how to fill our hole at catcher for the upcoming game.
Wyatt, you got in?
I know, I finally made it into the club. Now I can play on your baseball team.
Awesome. This fixes everything. Henry got hurt and we didn't have a catcher, but now we do.
And it's about time.
How'd you get over your fear of the trampoline?
I didn't use the dang trampoline.
What do you mean you didn't use the trampoline? How'd you get in here?
I built a ladder.
What?
Now everybody can be a member of the Peach Street Club.
We have to destroy that ladder. It breaks all of our traditions.
Jeremy was right. What would our forefathers think of me if under my presidency, our club became open to everyone? Before Wyatt's Ladder, we were exclusive. You had to be someone special to be a part of the club.
We have to get rid of the ladder.
Do you know about it stinks?
I
not to
don't know
be
what
in
came over
a
me.
club that your
I was
best friend's in?
furious at Wyatt.
I won't do it.
You won't. I will.
I won't let you.
With those angry thoughts surrounding me, I pushed Wyatt out of the clubhouse. Wyatt didn't talk to me for a long time. We had been friends since we were born, but I ruined all that with one small push. But that Saturday, we lost our game, and we came home disappointed. As we prepared to leave for the club, Mom pulled Zach and I aside.
I have to go grab Zach and I'll tell you guys a story.
Back in ancient China, a man learned how to fly. He invented a flying machine and flew over the palace.
The emperor saw him flying over and asked him to come down and speak with him. Although the emperor was impressed with the machine, he was also scared that if the wrong person had the technology, he could lead an army over China's Great Wall and conquer China. The emperor was afraid of the invention, and instead of using the technology to help his people, he destroyed it and killed the only man who could recreate it.
Don't you see the story being a little bit similar to what happened with you guys, right? With the flying machine, the world didn't have flight for thousands of years because of that. So what do you think will happen without having Wyatt in the clubhouse and with his ladder? Do you think something big could happen that you're missing out on?
So what do you think after seeing that video? Did it surprise you that the kids were able to bring in that new person? Did it surprise you that they initially excluded the new person? Did it surprise you that they had rules built up that stopped any kind of creativity? You know, the world is much like that today. Sometimes we ignore, avoid, or depreciate creativity if it comes in the way of something new and unexpected. We have to somehow find within ourselves a way of progressing with the new technology and the new creativity. Here's a quote that I think deals very poignantly with that issue. There are indeed certain instances in which social, cultural realities largely determine the possibility or lack of possibility for developing creativity in a given field. In other words, there are social things that, if negative toward creativity, will prevent it, but if positive, will bring it in. Again, we can get a quote from the man who has more patents than any other person who has ever lived. He's a Japanese man, and his name is Yoshiro Nakamatsu. Let's read what he says about creativity. So you feel that creativity comes from a balance of regimentation and freedom? Yes, but freedom is most important of all. Genius lies in developing complete and perfect freedom within a human being. So he believes very strongly that periods that allow freedom are periods that accentuate or permit or promote creativity. Now, the other side supposes that creativity changes civilization. Let's take a look at a quote there. This is by Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. He is an expert in creativity, and he says, creativity is the engine that drives cultural evolution. That is, of course, one of the bases of this course, that creativity has driven history forward. But we must not forget the other side, that history's various periods have promoted or depreciated creativity. Let's just review that history that we have discussed. First, Mesopotamian creativity. This was the time of the agricultural revolution when people first domesticated grains, and that allowed them to live in cities and to differentiate their occupations. Before this period of time, humans were mostly hunter-gatherers without the ability to live in an urban setting. They did not have metals to any great extent, but because of this gathering together, they were able to establish the Bronze Age, the Iron Age, and other metallic ages where metals were used effectively. Invasions brought new cultures. Mesopotamia had relatively few natural boundaries, and therefore invasions were frequent. But in this area we find a good thing. Each invasion seemed to retain all of the previous knowledge and just capitalized on it. So we don't see a casting away of previous knowledge, but rather a retention and a use of whatever knowledge was there. Finally, from Mesopotamia, we see a powerful influence on religion for much of the Western world. It was the Hebrew religion, and the Hebrews were somewhat separated from other people because of that religion, and probably because of that separation and the creation of an early book, the Bible. They were able to retain a strong religious influence over societies until the present day. Egypt was the next area that we considered, and it was, of course, dominated by the early Egyptian rulers who built the pyramids, and then into a period of decline, and then back into another area of strength when the great temples of Luxor and Karnak were built. That first period was also a time when hieroglyphs were developed, and we see the powerful use of hieroglyphs in recording history and recording the important events of a pharaoh's life. Egypt was certainly a country dominated by religion. They believed in an afterlife, and the pyramids, the temples, and most of their society was focused around a quest for eternal life, both trying to find a way to preserve their bodies, as well as gathering a place where they could be protected until they were resurrected or until they moved into this next life. Egypt, because of deserts and other physical impediments, was isolated throughout much of its culture. They did go on raiding parties. They would capture areas, bring back treasures, but largely they did not occupy other treasures because it was part of Egyptian religion that they would want to be buried on Egyptian soil. We then talked about the Indian culture. They also lacked powerful boundaries on one side, and therefore through that side they were often conquered. One of the most important of those conquerings occurred around 1300 BC when Aryans came into India from the northwest. The Aryans were probably a lighter-skinned people, and they established the caste system. The caste system was a way to separate lighter-skinned ruling groups from darker-skinned servant groups. That caste system merged with the religion that was there or that was brought in. That religion became Hinduism. There are other branches of Hinduism and religions that have sprung up along with Hinduism in that territory: Jainism, Sikhism, and Buddhism. Buddhism became very powerful, but later on was driven out of India by those who would have a pure Hindu society. The Indians were powerful in mathematics, including the concept of zero that was transmitted first to the Arabs and then finally in the Middle Ages period to Europe. India had great buildings. We can see some of them today. They understood the need for oven-dried bricks, for instance, to continue with the longevity of those buildings. And that is quite an advance over the sun-dried bricks of Mesopotamia and Egypt. We then discussed Chinese creativity. China was relatively isolated and rarely invaded, but they were threatened by the Mongols, and therefore they built the Great Wall. Some of the concepts from China included a dependence of the government on bureaucrats, and the bureaucrats were controlled in their actions by the writings and teachings of Confucius. In addition to that, the Chinese had great inventors, especially toward what we would consider the medieval period, when they invented gunpowder and the compass. We then considered Greek and Hellenistic culture, and of course this became the basis of Western culture in terms of philosophy, mathematics, science, and language. There were great oral stories that eventually became recorded as the Iliad and the Odyssey, and they provided the basis of modern writing. We also see the conflict between leisure time and war, and how leisure favors creativity, but war sometimes demands creativity. We see both of them occurring in that society. Certainly Alexander's conquering of the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, was a powerful influence on Western society because that Eastern Mediterranean gave us the New Testament, the Greek language, and Greek influence throughout that area, and provided a basis for the civilization that we then discovered, the Romans. The Romans loved to take other people's ideas and improve them. They were great engineers, not so good in pure science, but if they could make it work, then they would do it. They could build bridges and aqueducts, arches, wonderful buildings, domed arcades. The Romans were builders. They could connect everything with roads. In addition to all of that, they established a system of government that provided stability. And in addition to that, they gave us a way of life, an urban society where people were content. The Roman society was a society people loved living in. And up until the time of its destruction, the Roman people, we are assured, were relatively happy in their society. One of the successor states to the Romans were the Byzantines. They are the ones who were direct successors. They called themselves Romans. They were located in the area surrounding Constantinople. They gave us some beautiful buildings. Hagia Sophia was, at the time it was built, the largest church in Christendom, and it had marvelous architectural innovations. They also taught us about art through icons, and they believed at a certain point that those icons were worshiping idols, and therefore they attempted to destroy them. But the people revolted. They wouldn't accept that, and they came back and reinstituted icons as a vehicle for worship. They also had Greek fire that sprayed out chemical that was difficult to put out and burned opposing ships. They started the port of Venice as a way for the Byzantines to trade with Europe, and Venice continues today as a beautiful port and clearly a place where culture was thriving. Another successor to the Roman Empire, albeit somewhat removed, was the Islamic society. Their creativity was, of course, the religion of Islam and the impetus that it gave Arab people for success. Because of that wonderful impetus for creativity and success, they developed beautiful architectural symbols like the Dome of the Rock. They gave us beautiful literature and Arabic script as an art form. Science was powerfully developed during the period that Islam was in their flower. And we later see Islamic influences throughout Western society. For instance, just think of many of the words that begin with AL, alcohol, alchemy, aldehyde. These are chemical words, and they are all associated with Islamic culture. A third descendant from the Roman Empire is medieval European society. This was the poor sister of the three. Shortly after the fall of Rome in the Western Empire, the society just struggled to survive. They were not able to rise above subsistence farming. Perhaps that's because there was so much lawlessness and raiding of Germanic conquerors. These poor people struggled for a few hundred years until finally they realized that there was something greater that needed to be accomplished, and they started to progress in language, progress in architecture. The Catholic Church was one of the things that helped this progress and fostered things like beautiful Gothic cathedrals. It was a period of war and politics, a struggle between church and king, initially dominated by the church, and later, after the year 1000, dominated by kings. We see some literature like Dante's Divine Comedy emerging from this period, and they were certainly religious in their orientation, as was almost all of Europe during the Middle Ages. So that brings us to a question about creativity in general. Let me read you this quote. "Solving a problem is like looking for valuable antiques. You will find only junk unless you know what you are looking for. Great new ideas are too different from our current thinking and too similar to non-solutions to be casually recognized. But when we know what to look for, the probability of finding a great solution soars. The ancient genius Archimedes took baths all of his life, and each time he entered the bath, the water rose. But only when he was looking for a way to measure the volume of the king's crown did he recognize the rising water as a brilliant volume measuring solution. To find a breakthrough that exciting, you must have a clear vision of the solution that you are seeking. Then you too can recognize your answer when you step into it." Let me suggest that in order to recognize the solution, we need to have a broad enough understanding of many different areas that we can draw from one area to supplement the knowledge that we have in another. It's too bad that the world has divided into two separate camps. We see this in this representation. The scientists are on one end of the spectrum, the humanists are on the other end, and rarely do the scientists and the humanists talk to each other. Too much of our society is specialized. Scientists talking to scientists. And it's not even that general. It's chemists talking to chemists, biologists talking to biologists. The humanists tend to look more broadly, but they rarely understand the concepts of science. Therefore, this class has attempted to mix all of those different concepts together: science, humanism, art, politics. They're all thrust together so that we consider them simultaneously. We want to maximize our creativity, and therefore we've learned from many disciplines. I think you'll be surprised at how many disciplines we've covered. We have taken a case study method. That is, we've looked at people to understand better their creativity, what things made them creative and what environmental conditions existed, and what was the process of creativity. But in addition to that, we've looked at each discipline along with all of the other disciplines together. Let me give you some examples. We looked at history. Certainly that was the backbone of the course. Mesopotamia, Egypt, India, Greece, Rome, Byzantium, Islam, Middle Ages Europe, and pre-Columbian Americas. It just flowed in a chronological order. But we also looked at law, the Hammurabi Code and the Bible, Draconian law, Augustinian law, the great Roman law, Justinian who changed it, and Magna Carta who gave us modern, modified or limited monarchies. Well, along with law, we looked at government, kings and pharaohs and democracy, the Roman Republic and its change to the Roman Empire. We looked at religious domination, both in Islam and in medieval Europe. We looked at feudal systems and finally the emergence of nations. Well, that leads us directly to a consideration of religion. And there we looked at the Hebrew religion and pagan religions and their interactions. We looked at Hinduism and Buddhism, Christianity and the changes that occurred early in Christianity, and Islam. Well, religion would surely lead us to a study of architecture. And so we looked at ziggurats and pyramids, both religious edifices. We looked at Egyptian and Greek temples, again, religious edifices. But we also looked at the secular side, Roman arches, vaults, and domes, Islamic architecture, and Gothic cathedrals. Well, that would mean that we needed to understand a little bit about science, engineering, and technology. Remember, the early Greeks said, "I can understand it." They believed that they could understand all things that happened in the world given enough time and scientific study. They were, in fact, the originators of science. They tried to find a fundamental, a non-changing entity. Some thought it was water. Others thought it was fire. Some believed that it was small whole numbers. And Plato said that it wasn't anything that was physical, it was instead an idea, a form, a spiritual kind of conception that gathered things together and gave us a template on which the physical world was copied. We also understand deviations from Plato's concept with Aristotelian methods. And then we see Archimedes talk to us about levers and catapults and buoyancy. Shortly thereafter, Euclid gave us geometry. We also learned about Roman roads and the Ptolemaic universe and the way he had to invent things creatively to make the movement of the heavenly bodies come out to be right. Luckily, in the Middle Ages, we see agricultural advances like the plow, and finally, the adoption of Arabic number systems to simplify our bookkeeping. On the artistic side, we see culture, with sculpture as one of the earliest ways that we understand how people try and present aesthetically the world around them. We see the staid and conservative Egyptian sculpture giving way to the dynamic and beautiful and realistic Greek sculpture, especially in the Hellenistic form. We see Romans copying Greek art, and then we see medieval sculpture dominated by views of Christianity. Painting, too, went through some phases. Egyptian hieroglyphs were utilitarian. Greek painting was beautiful but primitive. Medieval painting was flat and representational, whereas we see Islamic painting did not involve people but involved beautiful designs and calligraphy. Music, which is the most abstract of all of the arts, was difficult for us to nail down. Anciently, we think that dramas, Greek dramas, were presented as musicals. But it's hard to tell because we have so little information about what was played, it simply disappeared into the ears of those who attended. But in the medieval period, we see Gregorian chants or plain chants coming in as a way of reinforcing and improving the Mass. Later, we see polyphony, a more complicated form of music. It was very appealing, but some members of the church thought that it was disruptive of the Mass, and so they insisted on an improvement. And it did get improved. Philosophy was explored in depth because in the early part of civilization, philosophy became the method of discovering truth. They were not skilled in science and not skilled in other truth-seeking methods. So philosophy was perhaps the default method of discovering truth until philosophy was overtaken by religion, and religion then became the default method. Later, science became the default. But the dialectical method of Socrates was this question and answer system that was developed to try and establish a way of thinking. Then, as I've already mentioned, Plato gave us the form, an ethereal kind of model on which the world was created. Descending from those Greek philosophers, we find ways of living, ethical systems by the Stoics or the Epicureans. Then, in the midst of the Middle Ages, there was a way of learning that was invented called scholasticism. It combined some of the concepts of Aristotle with some of the concepts of the Catholic Church. And it was presented chiefly in the universities of Paris, but other places as well, by men like Thomas Aquinas. The great Buddha gave us philosophical concepts in terms of asceticism and self-denial. Confucius then taught us how we should respect other people within our society, and Lao Tzu taught us how to respect nature. In literature, we learned first about Homer and the great Iliad and the Odyssey that provided a foundation for all Western literature. Copying the form of Homer, we see Virgil and the concepts of the Aeneid. In between them, we find a very interesting blind Greek, perhaps a slave, whose name was Aesop. He gave us great stories, and they taught us how to live properly. Another way to teach us how to live were chivalry legends. If you were a knight, you needed to be chivalrous. And in fact, you covenanted that part of your duty would be to live a chivalrous life. It was a way of controlling the behavior of these otherwise uncontrollable warriors. Toward the end of the period that we've discussed are Dante and Chaucer. Dante gave us the Italian language solidified in his work, The Divine Comedy. Chaucer gave us the Middle English language solidified in his work, Canterbury Tales. Where Dante discussed religion and a person's personal quest for salvation, Chaucer gave us secular knowledge and a group of people who, while on a religious journey, were certainly not anxious for their own personal salvation. They were anxious to share their lives in a rather boisterous way. But this concept of a journey to search for truth was typical of the medieval period and the period before. Finally, we come to a concept that I think is modern and yet stretches back into the period that we have discovered. What are the motivations for people to act? Abraham Maslow was a psychologist, and he gave us a hierarchy of human needs. The bottom part of this hierarchy, here depicted as a pyramid, are the physiological needs: air, water, food. These needs are so compelling that we must satisfy them in order to live. And the motivation for satisfying them is very, very strong. If you doubt that, just hold your breath for 5 or 10 minutes and see how strong that motivation is. After we have satisfied those physiological needs, we come to needs concerning safety. People are frightened of dying, and they need to feel safe. If they don't feel safe, they will do almost anything to gain that safety. Then, after being safe, people have a strong need for love and belonging. The family is, after all, not only a place of safety, but a place where people can find the love that they so strongly need. After love and belonging, people start to think about, what do I want to do with my life? How should I view myself? What can I do to be of value? They look for self-esteem. It's hard to be useful in life if we don't think that we are ourselves of value. Therefore, self-esteem is the next level, and that is followed by self-actualization. That somewhat confusing term simply means you find something that you can do that benefits society. It is at this level that we find creativity. No, creativity is not a fundamental need of mankind at the most basic levels. It is something that mankind seeks to do, but in order to get there, you have to satisfy all of those levels below it, including self-esteem. Creativity requires courage. It requires confidence. It requires the ability to make a mistake and move on past it. But the reward of creativity is self-actualization, fulfillment, contribution. We are told that on his deathbed, Maslow suggested that there was one more level, one that he had not yet explored, a level yet to be fully articulated. And he said to his daughter, that level beyond self-actualization is a level called charity. It is the giving of oneself to others. Yes, after creativity, we are rewarded by sharing ourselves and our creativity with the world, not for the sake of accomplishment, but for the sake of charity. I think Maslow was right. The hierarchy of human needs does in fact motivate people. And I hope that Maslow's final charity accomplishment was really said by Maslow, and that we do understand that charity follows creativity to lead us into a better world. I hope that this class has led you to a better world, personally, as well as in understanding. Thank you for inviting me into your presence. It's been nice to get to know you. Bye-bye.